If you close your eyes and picture a Viking, your mind likely produces a very specific image. You see a towering, broad-shouldered man with a face smeared with soot or dried blood. His hair is a matted tangle of unwashed filth. His clothes are a chaotic arrangement of dark leathers and heavy, unrefined furs. And, most importantly, perched atop his head is a massive iron helmet adorned with the sweeping horns of a bull or perhaps the wings of a raven. He is a creature of the primeval wild, a barbarian who exists outside the boundaries of civilization, a man who smells of rot and wood smoke. This image is powerful, it is cinematic, and it is almost entirely a lie. To understand the people of the Viking Age, we must first perform an act of historical iconoclasm. We have to take that horned helmet and throw it into the sea, because in the entire archaeological record of the Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th century to the mid-11th, not a single horned helmet has ever been found. Not one. If this fact just shattered the image you've held since childhood, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We're about to dismantle everything you thought you knew about the North. And I'm curious, tell me in the comments, what was the first movie or game that convinced you Vikings wore horns? To find the source of this aesthetic fallacy, we have to look not at the battlefields of the North, but at the opera houses of the 19th century. In 1876, the costume designer Carl Emil Doppler was tasked with creating the look for Richard Wagner's monumental Ring Cycle. Drawing on a wave of romantic nationalism that was sweeping across Europe, Doppler wanted to make the Norse gods and heroes look ancient and elemental. He reached back into the mists of time and borrowed motifs from Bronze Age ritual headgear. Items like the Vexo helmets, which did indeed have horns, but predated the Vikings by over 1,000 years. The image stuck. It was reinforced by Victorian painters who wanted to contrast the primitive Northman with the civilized European. But the reality found in the cold earth of Scandinavia tells a vastly different story. If we look at the Geirmundbu helmet, the only near-complete helmet ever recovered from a Viking Age site, we see a piece of equipment that is a masterpiece of functional engineering. It is a sleek, rounded iron cap designed to deflect the downward blow of a sword or an axe. It features a spectacle guard, a protective plate that covers the nose and surrounds the eyes, giving the warrior a haunting, owl-like appearance. There are no horns, no wings, nothing that a foe could grab onto or that would catch a weapon and break the wearer's neck. It was a tool of professional soldiers who understood that in the chaos of a shield wall, vanity was a death sentence. But the myth of the Viking aesthetic goes deeper than just the helmet. We have been conditioned to believe that these were people who lived in a state of permanent grime. Yet the archaeological record suggests they were perhaps the most fastidious people in all of medieval Europe. When archaeologists excavate a Viking Age settlement like Hedeby or Birka, they find weapons, yes, but they find something else in even greater quantities: grooming kits. Thousands of exquisitely carved bone and antler combs, tweezers, ear spoons for removing wax, and sharp razors. The Norsemen were obsessed with their hair. It wasn't just about vanity. It was a matter of social status and hygiene. To have well-groomed hair was to show that you had the time and the resources to care for yourself. It was a mark of a free man, a carl, or a jarl. This attention to detail drove the contemporary Anglo-Saxons to distraction. We have the letters of English monks complaining that the pagan Danes were far too successful with the local women because they bathed every Saturday, combed their hair every day, and changed their clothes frequently. They called Saturday Laugardaggur, which literally translates to washing day, a tradition that remains embedded in the Scandinavian languages to this day. While the rest of Europe was often mired in a period where frequent bathing was viewed with suspicion or even as a sin, the Norseman was standing in a wooden tub, scrubbing himself with lye soap. This soap was high in potassium and was used not just for cleanliness, but for aesthetic modification. The Norse prize for beauty was golden blonde hair. For those not born with it, the high alkaline lye soap acted as a bleaching agent, lightening the hair and the beard to a sun-bleached pale. They would even use it to kill head lice, ensuring that the elaborate braids we see in their art were clean and orderly. The idea that they only wore drab, dark leathers is another casualty of the archaeological truth. If you could step into a 10th century market in the Viking world, you would be blinded by the color. The Norse loved vibrant, saturated hues. Through the analysis of textile fragments found in high-status burials like the Oseberg ship, we can reconstruct a world of vivid reds, deep blues, and brilliant yellows. They used madder root to produce a fiery crimson, woad for a sky blue, and weld for a sharp yellow. These were not the colors of people hiding in the shadows. These were the colors of a people who wanted to be seen. A wealthy merchant or a chieftain's wife would drape themselves in layers of fine wool and linen, often trimmed with silk that had traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road from Byzantium or Persia. They wore silver and gold thread woven into their hems, a technique known as posement, which shimmered in the firelight of the longhouse. The women wore distinctive oval brooches, often called tortoise brooches, which were used to fasten the straps of their apron dresses. These weren't just functional. They were intricate works of art, cast in bronze and then gilded, covered in complex interlacing patterns of mythical beasts. To look at a Viking woman of status was to look at a walking display of her family's wealth and global connections. We must also reconsider the very fabric of their lives. We often imagine them in heavy, thick furs, but the primary material of the Viking Age was wool. But this was not the wool we know today. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered textile. The sheep of the north, like the Icelandic sheep, had a double coat, a soft, insulating underlayer, and a long, coarse, water-repellent outer layer. When woven together, this created a fabric that was essentially the medieval equivalent of a modern Gore-Tex jacket. It was breathable, warm even when wet, and incredibly durable. The creation of this cloth was the hidden engine of the Viking Age. It took more hours of labor to shear, card, spin, and weave the wool for a single longship's sail than it did to build the wooden ship itself. This was the work of the women, a rhythmic, communal labor that defined the soundscape of the village. The clack-clack of the warp-weighted loom was the heartbeat of Norse society. They produced high-quality wadmal, a standardized wool cloth so reliable that it was used as a form of legal tender in Iceland and Norway. The hairstyles themselves were far more deliberate and varied than the shaved sides and long top we see in modern television. One contemporary account from an 11th century English letter describes the Danish fashion of the time. Hair that was grown very long in the front, falling over the eyes and face, but shaved short, or even completely bare at the back of the head. It was a striking, intentional look, designed to be seen from the front under a helmet. Beards were not wild and unkempt. They were trimmed, forked, and often braided. In Norse society, a man's beard was a sacred thing. To cut another man's beard against his will was a grave legal offense that could lead to a blood feud. It was a symbol of his manhood and his legal standing as a free person. This brings us to the smell of the Viking world. We assume it was the scent of unwashed bodies and decay, but the reality would have been far more complex. It would have been the sharp, clean scent of lye soap. It would have been the smell of wood tar, or tjere, which they used to waterproof everything from their ships to their leather boots. It would have been the smell of the sea, certainly, but also the smell of expensive imported spices and the smoky sweetness of the beeswax candles used by the wealthy. Even their leather was not the heavy, dark biker gear of fiction. Viking age leather was tanned using vegetable tannins from oak or birch bark, resulting in a supple, reddish-brown material that was often embossed with delicate patterns. They wore shoes that were turn shoes, sewn inside out and then flipped, creating a sleek, form-fitting silhouette that was a far cry from the bulky boots we imagine. To understand the aesthetic of the Norse is to understand a people who lived at the intersection of a brutal landscape and a flourishing global trade network. They were people who lived in a world of sharp contrasts: the white of the snow, the deep black of the volcanic earth, and the brilliant, artificial colors of their clothing. They were not trying to blend into the mud. They were trying to stand out against it. Their appearance was a form of communication. Every brooch, every bead of amber or carnelian, every strip of silk was a signal of where they had been, who they had traded with, and how much luck, or hamingja, they possessed. The Viking Age was not a time of drab, gray survival. It was a symphony of color, a meticulous attention to the body, and a deep, abiding pride in one's personal presentation. When we look at them through the lens of archaeology, the barbarian vanishes, and in his place stands a person who is shockingly familiar, someone who cares about how they are perceived, someone who values craft and beauty, and someone who knows that even in a world of swords and axes, the most powerful thing you can carry is your identity, worn proudly for all to see. This obsession with identity extended even to the very teeth in their heads. In several Viking Age burials across Scandinavia and the British Isles, archaeologists have made a startling discovery: skeletons with horizontal grooves filed precisely into their front teeth. These weren't accidental marks or the result of wear and tear. They were intentional, painful modifications, likely filled with colored pigment, perhaps red or charcoal black. Imagine the sight of a warrior smiling at you, his teeth marked with the stripes of his status or his cultic affiliation. This was a culture that viewed the human body as a canvas. They were a people of the surface as much as the soul. The Arabic chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met the Norse traders on the Volga River in the 10th century, remarked that they were perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms. But he also noted that they were covered from fingernails to neck in dark green tattoos, representing trees and figures. While the word he used, titlia, is often debated by linguists, the image he paints is consistent with a people who use their skin to tell their story. When we move past the myth, we find that the Viking look was a carefully curated expression of a complex society. It was a society that valued the artisan as much as the raider. The man who forged the pattern-welded sword was also the man who might carve a delicate bone pin for his wife's hair. The woman who managed the farm was also the master weaver who decided the color palette of her kin's winter cloaks. This was not a world of accidental aesthetics. It was a world where the way you looked told the world exactly who you were, where you stood in the hierarchy of the thing, and whether you were a person of drengskaper, a person of honor and worth. The horned helmet was never necessary, because the reality was far more intimidating. A disciplined, clean, brightly colored warrior who knew exactly who he was and had the silver to prove it. As we peel back the layers of Victorian fantasy, we see that the true tragedy of the barbarian myth is that it robs the Norse of their sophistication. By imagining them as dirty, horn-headed savages, we ignore the incredible logistical and artistic infrastructure required to produce their world. To make a single blue tunic required a knowledge of botany, chemistry, and international trade. To produce a spectacle helmet like the one from Yermunbu required a mastery of ironworking and a deep understanding of the physics of combat. These were not people who stumbled out of the woods. They were the products of a refined, albeit violent, civilization. They were globalists long before the term existed, and their clothing reflected that. A single grave might contain a cloak from Ireland, silk from Byzantium, and a belt buckle influenced by the art of the Frankish courts. They were the great synthesizers of the Middle Ages, taking the best of what they found in their travels and weaving it into a unique northern identity. So when we look at the Viking Age, we must replace the soot with soap, the fur with fine woven wool, and the horns with the glint of polished iron and gold. We must hear the sound of the comb through the hair and the splash of the Saturday bath. We must see the red and the blue and the yellow of the sails and the tunics. Only then can we begin to see the Vikings as they saw themselves, as a people of style, of status, and of a profound, colorful humanity that thrived in one of the harshest environments on earth. They were not ghosts of the past, but a living, breathing, and remarkably clean people who left an indelible mark on the world, not just through their raids, but through the sheer, vibrant force of their culture. This was the reality of the North, not a nightmare of darkness, but a world of light, color, and a meticulous, beautiful order that defined an era. This was the aesthetic fallacy corrected, a transformation of our understanding that allows the real people of the Viking Age to finally step out of the shadows and into the sun. To truly grasp the weight of this aesthetic, consider the tortoise brooches again. These were not just jewelry. They were the anchors of a woman's identity. Usually found in pairs, they held up the overdress, but from them hung chains. And from those chains hung the tools of her daily life: a small knife, a whetstone, a needle case, and most importantly, her keys. The sound of a Viking woman walking was the sound of metal on metal, a rhythmic jingle that announced her authority. The keys were a symbol of her legal status as the husfreyja, the lady of the house. In a world where the men were often away for months or years at a time, these keys represented the woman's total control over the household's wealth, its food, and its survival. If a man tried to take those keys from her, he was not just committing a domestic slight, he was violating the social contract of the North. The aesthetic was the law made visible. And what of the men's jewelry? The Viking Age was the age of the ring giver. A leader's worth was measured by his generosity, and this was expressed through the distribution of arm rings, heavy bands of silver or gold worn on the forearm. These were often designed to be hack silver, meaning they could be cut into smaller pieces to be used as currency. A warrior's aesthetic was literally his bank account. He wore his wealth. The glint of a silver arm ring was a signal to his peers that he served a successful and generous lord. It was a visual language of loyalty and success. When we look at the hoard from Silverdale or Querdale, we see thousands of these items, a testament to an economy that was as much about display as it was about trade. The very landscape they inhabited was shaped by this aesthetic of display. The great mounds of Old Uppsala or the ship burials of Oseberg and Gokstad were not just graves. They were monuments designed to be seen from the water. They were part of a theater of the dead, where the appearance of the funeral, the colors of the ship's sail, the quality of the sacrificed horse's harness, the richness of the buried textiles, served to cement the status of the living. Even in death, the Norse refused to be drab. They went into the earth surrounded by the finest things the world could offer: tapestries depicting myths and legends, carved carts, and beds of soft down feathers. This is the world we find when we stop looking for the savage and start looking for the Norseman. It is a world of incredible complexity, where a piece of bone can be carved into a comb of such delicacy that it rivals modern art, and where a piece of iron can be forged into a helmet that is both a shield for the head and a mask for the soul. The aesthetic of the Viking Age was not a mask for their brutality, but an expression of their vitality. It was their way of saying that they were here, that they were powerful, and that they were beautiful. And that, in the end, is a truth far more compelling than any horned helmet could ever be. It is the truth of a people who lived with their eyes wide open to the world, taking its colors, its fabrics, and its riches, and making them their own. It is a story of pride, of craftsmanship, and of a deep-seated need to be remembered, not as monsters, but as a people who brought light and color to the edge of the known world. The sophisticated nature of their appearance also speaks to a society with specialized classes. You do not get high-quality madder-dyed wool or gilded bronze brooches in a society of disorganized raiders. You get them in a society with master dyers, professional jewelers, and sophisticated trade networks that could move goods from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. The Vikings were globalists by necessity and by choice. Their aesthetic was a Viking synthesis, a unique brand that blended the animal art styles of the Germanic past with the floral motifs of the Carolingian Empire and the geometric precision of the Islamic world. This wasn't the work of a people stuck in the past. It was the work of a people looking outward, absorbing the world around them and reflecting it back in a way that was uniquely, undeniably their own. As we conclude this exploration of the Norse aesthetic, let the image of the horned barbarian fade. Replace him with a man standing on the deck of a longship, his hair bleached pale and neatly braided, his blue tunic trimmed with silk and silver wire, his spectacle helmet glinting in the cold northern sun. Beside him stands a woman whose keys jingle at her waist, her red apron dress fastened with gilded brooches that catch the light, her eyes reflecting a world she manages with steady hands. They are clean, they are colorful, and they are formidable. They are the real Vikings, a people who understood that power is not just about the strength of your arm, but about the clarity of your identity and the beauty of the world you build for yourself. This is the history we find in the soil, a history of human beings who, like us, cared about how they were seen and how they would be remembered. And they were right to care, for even a millennium later, we are still captivated by the world they created, a world that was, and is, far more brilliant than the myths suggest. The sound of Viking warfare is not the sound of a scream or a chaotic roar. If you were standing on a cold field in Northumbria in the late 9th century, the first thing you would hear would be a rhythmic, terrifying thud. It is the sound of thousands of pounds of lime-wood boards covered in hardened leather and rimmed with iron, slamming together in unison. This is the Skjaldborg, the shield wall, and it is the most misunderstood tactical formation in the history of the North. In our modern imagination, fueled by high-budget television and heavy metal aesthetics, we see the Viking as a solitary predator, a shirtless, howling madman who breaks ranks to throw himself into the enemy with a total disregard for his own life. We call this man a berserker. We imagine him fueled by hallucinogenic mushrooms, frothing at the mouth, biting the rim of his shield in a state of religious ecstasy. But if the Viking Age had truly been won by such men, it would have lasted exactly one generation. In the cold, hard logic of medieval combat, a man who leaves the protection of his brothers is a man who dies quickly. To understand the true power of the Norse military machine, we must dismantle the myth of the mindless savage and replace it with the reality of the professional soldier. The Norsemen were not successful because they were more violent than their neighbors. They were successful because they were better organized, more disciplined, and possessed a tactical geometry that few in Western Europe could match. The foundation of everything was the shield. When we look at the shields recovered from the Gokstad ship burial, we see a design that is a marvel of balance and utility. They were roughly 30 to 36 inches in diameter, constructed from planks of lime wood, which is light enough to be carried for hours, but fibrous enough that it does not easily split under the impact of an axe. The shield was not held by a strap on the arm like a medieval heater shield. It was gripped by a central iron handle behind a heavy metal boss. This allowed the warrior to use the shield actively, to punch, to parry, and to extend his reach. But when the battle began, the individual vanished into the collective. The Skjaldborg was a living wall. The warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping like the scales of a serpent. The man to your right covered your sword side. You covered the man to your left. This was not a formation born of frenzy. It was a formation born of absolute trust. To stand in a shield wall was to enter a contract of mutual survival. If a single man broke, if a single man let his fear or his ego drive him forward or backward, the seam would open and the wall would collapse. This required a level of drill and psychological conditioning that is entirely absent from our pop culture depictions. Imagine the physical reality of the shield press, what the sagas call the Hildarleikur, or the game of battle. Two walls of men, hundreds of yards long, would slam into each other with the force of two slow-moving freight trains. The air would vanish. You would be pressed so tightly against your comrades that you could barely breathe. The smell of wet wool, iron, and the sudden, sharp scent of human fear filling your nostrils. You didn't swing your sword in wide, cinematic arcs. There was no room. Instead, you used a short seax or a thrusting spear to find gaps, under the rim of the opposite shield, through the eye slits of a helmet, at the unprotected shins. It was a grinding, agonizing test of endurance. Success was measured in inches. If you could push the enemy back, if you could make them stumble over the bodies of the fallen, their wall would begin to fracture. And it was only then, when the formation broke and the enemy turned to flee, that the Viking of our imagination truly appeared. The slaughter happened during the rout, not during the standoff. So, where does the berserker fit into this world of iron discipline? The word berserker likely means bear shirt, referring to a cult of warriors who claimed to be possessed by the spirit of the bear or the wolf. These were not the common soldiers. They were an elite, often functioning as the personal bodyguards of a konungur or a jarl. They were psychological weapons. In a world where belief in the supernatural was absolute, the sight of a man who appeared not to feel pain, who howled like a beast, and who bit his shield in a ritualized display of ODR or divine rage was a devastating tool of terror. But the idea that they were high on Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom, is a theory that has largely been debunked by modern toxicology. The fly agaric causes sweating, tremors, and a profound loss of coordination. Hardly the traits you want in an elite warrior. Recent botanical research suggests a more likely candidate, Hyoscyamus niger, or henbane. Henbane can induce a state of intense rage, a feeling of superhuman strength, and, crucially, a dulling of physical pain, followed by a period of total exhaustion and memory loss. But even with chemical assistance, the berserker was a tactical outlier. He was used to break a deadlock, to spearhead a svinfylking or boar snout formation, a wedge designed to pierce the enemy line. He was the tip of the spear, but he was always backed by the steady, unmoving weight of the shield wall. The svinfylking itself is proof of the Norseman's tactical sophistication. It was a triangular formation, allegedly taught to the Norse by Odin himself. The most experienced and heavily armored men formed the point, with the wedge widening behind them. This was a formation designed to exploit a specific weakness in an enemy line. It required precise timing and the ability to move as a single organism. If the wedge hit with enough momentum, it would split the enemy's shield wall like a wood splitter's maul. Once the line was breached, the discipline of the enemy would vanish, and the drengskaper, the code of reckless courage, would take over. But again, this was not mindless violence. It was a calculated application of force. The Norse were professional raiders and mercenaries. They fought for silver, for land, and for reputation. Dying in battle was an honorable path to Valhalla, yes, but living to spend your loot in the markets of Hedeby was much better. This brings us to one of the most persistent and grisly myths of Viking warfare, the blood eagle. We have all seen it on screen, the victim's back carved open, the ribs hacked away from the spine, and the lungs pulled out to look like wings, while the victim remains miraculously alive. It is portrayed as the ultimate Norse execution, a ritual of supreme cruelty dedicated to Odin. But when we look at the actual sources, the blood eagle begins to dissolve into a linguistic misunderstanding. The descriptions of the ritual only appear in later sagas, written centuries after the Viking Age. often by Christian authors who had every reason to portray their pagan ancestors as demonic monsters. Most modern historians and anatomists agree that the blood eagle, as described, is a physical impossibility. The victim would die of massive pleural shock and blood loss the moment the first ribs were cut. Furthermore, the earliest skaldic poetry that mentions the eagle often uses it as a metaphor. In the complex kennings of Old Norse poetry, an eagle tearing at a man's back was a standard image for a bird of prey scavenging a corpse on a battlefield. It was a poetic way of saying someone had been killed and left for the birds. Over time, through a process of literalization and creative embellishment, this poetic image was transformed into a ritual of torture. The Vikings were certainly capable of extreme cruelty. Medieval warfare was a brutal business. No, the blood eagle is more likely a masterpiece of medieval horror fiction than a historical reality. The true cruelty of Viking warfare lay not in elaborate rituals, but in its relentless efficiency. They were masters of the strand hog, the lightning-fast beach raid. They utilized their naval superiority to appear where the enemy was weakest, striking at monasteries and trade hubs before a local fyrd or militia could even be raised. This was a form of total war that Western Europe was unprepared for. The Viking didn't want to meet you in a fair fight on a field of your choosing. He wanted to hit you in the dark, steal your church silver, take your young men and women as thralls or slaves, and be back on his ship before the sun rose. When they did stay to fight large-scale battles, they showed an uncanny ability to adapt. They learned from the Franks how to use cavalry, and they learned from the Byzantines how to build complex fortifications. They were not stagnant barbarians. They were the most adaptive military force of their age. We must also consider the role of the thing in warfare. The Norse military was not a top-down autocracy in the way we might imagine. The Bondi, the free farmers who made up the bulk of the army, were not peasants forced into service. They were stakeholders. A Viking army was a collection of free men who had agreed to follow a leader because that leader had a reputation for hamingja, or luck and success. If a jarl led his men into a disastrous battle or failed to distribute the loot fairly, his men would simply leave. The discipline of the shield wall was therefore not just a military necessity. It was a social one. You fought for the man next to you because he was your neighbor, your kinsman, or your partner in a commercial venture. This horizontal bond of loyalty was far stronger than the vertical bonds of feudalism that were beginning to take hold in the rest of Europe. The weapons themselves reflect this social reality. While the sword is the iconic Viking weapon, it was actually quite rare. A high-quality sword, like the famous Ulfbert blades, which utilized crucible steel imported from the East, was an incredibly expensive item, costing the equivalent of several dozen cows. Most men fought with the axe or the spear. The Viking axe was not a heavy, clumsy tool. The Dane axe, the massive two-handed weapon of the later Viking age, had a head that was surprisingly thin and light, allowing for lightning-fast strikes that could cleave through a helmet or a shield. The spear, however, was the true king of the battlefield. Cheap to produce and versatile in use, the Norse spear was used for both throwing and thrusting. In the sagas, the spear is the weapon of Odin, and the throwing of the spear over the enemy army was a ritual act that dedicated the fallen to the god of war. When we look at the archaeological evidence of Viking Age trauma, skeletons found in mass graves like the one at Repton, or the Ridgeway Hill burial, we see the clinical reality of this warfare. We see skulls split by downward axe blows, legs shorn off by low sword sweeps, and puncture wounds from spears. These injuries are not the work of frenzied amateurs. They are the work of men who knew exactly where to strike to bypass armor and bone. The Ridgeway Hill burial, in particular, shows a group of young men who were executed with professional precision, likely by a single blade. This wasn't a riot. It was a systematic removal of a threat. The psychological landscape of the Norse warrior was dominated by the concept of fate or word. They believed that the moment of a man's death was woven by the Norns at his birth. This was not a philosophy of despair, but one of liberation. If you cannot change when you will die, then the only thing that matters is how you face that death. This produced a culture of extreme bravery that looked to outside observers like insanity. If you die cowering, you are forgotten. If you die with a joke on your lips and your sword in your hand, your word fame will live forever. This is the heart of the berserker myth, not a chemical frenzy, but a philosophical one. The Norseman in the shield wall wasn't screaming because he was out of control. He was screaming because he was entirely in control of his own legacy. As we move through the history of these real raids, we find a people who transformed the act of violence into a refined craft. They understood the physics of the shield, the chemistry of the blade, and the psychology of the enemy. They were a people who could spend a week meticulously grooming their hair, and then stand in a freezing shield wall for 10 hours, holding the line against the greatest empires of the day. The mindless savage is a ghost created by the victims of their success, the monks who saw only the smoke and the blood. But if we listen to the sound of the limewood boards clashing together, if we see the geometry of the Svinfylking, and if we understand the trust required to stand shoulder to shoulder in the Skjaldborg, we see the truth. The Vikings didn't conquer because they were monsters. They conquered because they were the most disciplined, most adaptable, and most tactically brilliant warriors the medieval world had ever seen. The rage of the berserker was just the shadow cast by the cold, bright steel of the Norse shield wall. In the final analysis, the myth of the disorganized Viking horde serves to diminish their actual achievements. It is far more frightening and far more impressive to realize that the men who landed at Lindisfarne or sailed up the Seine were not a mob, but a coordinated strike force. They were men who could navigate the open ocean without a compass and then transition seamlessly into a complex military formation upon landing. Their warfare was an extension of their society, a society that valued law, property, and reputation. When the shield wall finally began to decline in the 11th century, replaced by the rising power of heavy cavalry and the stone castle, it wasn't because the Vikings had been tamed. It was because the world had finally caught up to their level of military professionalism. But for 3 centuries, the Skjaldborg was the dominant force in Europe. It was a wall of wood and iron that carved out kingdoms from Russia to England, and it was held together not by mushrooms or madness, but by the quiet, terrifying discipline of men who knew that their fate was already written, and that the only thing left to do was to fight well. The reality of the Viking warrior is found in that silence before the charge, in the grip on the shield handle, and in the unwavering gaze of a man who knows that his brothers stand beside him, and that the wall will not break. The image of the Norse woman in our modern culture is polarized between two extremes. On one hand, we have the Valkyrie, the supernatural shield maiden of the sagas, a fierce warrior clad in wings and iron who chooses who lives and dies on the battlefield. On the other, we have the silent, domestic shadow, a figure relegated to the background of history, while the men sail off to claim glory. But neither of these images captures the complex, high-stakes reality of being a woman in the Viking Age. To find the truth, we must travel to the Swedish island of Björkö, to the great trading hub of Birka, and look into a grave designated simply as BJ 581. For over a century, this grave was the quintessential example of a high-ranking Viking warrior. It contained a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, a battle knife, and 2 sacrificed horses, one a mare and one a stallion. It even contained a full set of gaming pieces, a strategic kit that signaled the occupant was a person of command, a tactician who understood the geometry of war. For 100 years, every archaeologist who looked at this grave assumed the occupant was a man. They didn't even check the bones. The weapons told the story. But in 2017, a team of Swedish geneticists conducted a DNA analysis on those remains, and the results sent a shockwave through the historical community. The warrior of Birka BJ 581 was biologically female. This discovery did more than just prove that women could be warriors. It exposed the deep-seated Victorian biases that have colored our understanding of the Viking Age for 2 centuries. The historians of the 19th century, living in a world where women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, could not imagine a past where gender roles were fluid enough to allow a woman to lead a warband. They saw what they expected to see. But the Viking world was not the Victorian world. It was a world of pragmatism and extreme environmental pressure, where competence often mattered more than convention. However, we must be careful not to swing the pendulum too far in the other direction. While BJ 581 proves that female combatants existed and could reach the highest echelons of military status, the true power of the Norse woman was not found at the edge of a sword, but in the clinking of the keys at her belt and the legal autonomy she held in her hands. In the Viking Age, the domestic sphere was not a place of subservience. It was a theater of executive power. When a woman married, she was given a set of keys. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a legal transfer of authority. These keys, often made of ornate bronze and worn hanging from her brooches, gave her total control over the innengards, the world within the fence. While the men were away, Viking, on raids, trading expeditions, or diplomatic missions that could last for years, the woman was the sole manager of the estate. She controlled the food stores, the wealth, the production of textiles, and the survival of the kin group. In a climate as unforgiving as Scandinavia, the ability to manage resources through a 6-month winter was the difference between life and death. A woman who mismanaged the farm was a greater threat to the family than any foreign raider. This role earned her the title of Husfreyja, the lady of the house, a position of such respect that any insult to her honor was met with the same legal severity as an insult to a chieftain. To understand the legal independence of these women, we have to look at the Gragaas, the early Icelandic law codes. Compared to the contemporary women of Christian Europe or the Mediterranean, the Norse woman was a legal anomaly. She had the right to inherit property, the right to own land, and, most shockingly, to outside observers, the right to divorce her husband. The process was remarkably straightforward. A woman seeking a divorce simply had to name her witnesses and declare her intent at the front door of her house, and again at the thing, the communal assembly. There were no priests to consult, no complex ecclesiastical courts to navigate. If the marriage wasn't working, she could end it. The grounds for divorce were broad. A woman could leave her husband for physical abuse, for failing to provide for the family, or even for socially inappropriate behavior. In one famous saga account, a woman divorces her husband because he wore a tunic that was cut too low at the neck, exposing his chest in a way she found shameful. Crucially, when a woman divorced, she took her dowry and any property she had brought into the marriage with her. This economic autonomy meant that Norse women were not trapped in cycles of dependency. They were stakeholders in the social fabric. This independence was rooted in the very fabric of the Norse economy: wool. We often forget that the Viking Age was built on cloth. A single longship required a sail of approximately 100 square meters. To produce that sail, starting from the shearing of the sheep to the final weaving on a warp-weighted loom, took an estimated 500 to 1,000 hours of labor. This was the exclusive domain of women. Every ship that sailed from the fjords of Norway or the coasts of Denmark was powered by the labor of women. Without the weavers, there were no raiders. This gave women a quiet but absolute leverage over the military ambitions of the men. They were the engineers of the maritime expansion. They understood the chemistry of dyes, the physics of tension, and the logistics of mass production. When we find spinning whorls and loom weights in female graves, we aren't just finding domestic tools. We are finding the instruments of a global superpower. However, the life of a Norse woman was also defined by a grim, existential tension. This was a society that practiced hamingja, a belief in ancestral luck. The woman was the vessel of this luck. She was responsible for the spiritual well-being of the family. This often brought her into the world of the vulva, the seeress or staff carrier. Archaeology has revealed graves of women buried with iron-tipped staffs, pouches of psychoactive seeds like henbane, and strange ritualistic charms. These women were the practitioners of seder, a form of magic that was considered ergi, or unmanly, for men to practice, but which gave women a terrifying degree of social and political influence. Even a king would tremble before a vulva. They were the intermediaries between the human world and the gods, the ones who could see the threads of the Norns. This spiritual authority was a form of soft power that could mobilize armies or stop a blood feud in its tracks. But we must also look at the darker side of this reality. For every husfreyja or vulva, there were countless thralls, enslaved women taken during raids in Ireland, England, or Eastern Europe. The Viking Age was fueled by human trafficking. These women had no keys, no legal rights, and no protection under the law. They were the invisible labor force that ground the grain and worked the looms until their fingers bled. The genetic legacy of the Viking Age tells a story of this displacement. Modern DNA in Iceland shows that while the majority of the male ancestors were Scandinavian, a massive percentage of the female ancestors were Gaelic. This is the silent testimony of the slave trade. The Norse woman's status was built on a hierarchy that was as brutal as it was sophisticated. The archaeological record also reveals the physical toll of this life. When we examine the skeletons of Norse women, we see the evidence of incredible physical strength but also of relentless labor. We see the wear on the joints from years of leaning over a loom, the dental wear from using teeth as a third hand in textile production, and the signs of nutritional stress during the lean years. Yet we also see signs of care. We see healed fractures that would have required months of nursing, and we see women living into their 60s and 70s, a significant age for the medieval world, suggesting a society that valued its elders. One of the most spectacular examples of female status is the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. Excavated in 1904, this 9th century royal burial contained the remains of two women, one in her 80s and one in her 50s. They were buried in a magnificent longship surrounded by a wealth of grave goods that defies description. There were carved sledges, a ceremonial cart, high-quality textiles, and even a bucket containing Persian silk. This was the grave of a queen, perhaps Queen Osa, the grandmother of Harold Fairhair. The sheer scale of the Oseberg burial proves that women could hold the highest possible rank in Norse society, not just as wives or mothers, but as sovereigns and religious leaders in their own right. The woman in this grave was sent into the afterlife with the same naval honors as any king. The power of the keys was also a power over memory. In an oral culture, it was the women who were often the keepers of the family genealogies and the stories of the ancestors. They were the ones who taught the children the sagas and the poems. They were the architects of the word fame that every Viking warrior craved. A man's reputation was often in the hands of the women who spoke of him after he was gone. This cultural role meant that women were the guardians of Norse identity. As the Viking Age moved toward the Christian era, it was often the women who were the first to adopt the new faith, or conversely, the most stubborn in holding on to the old ways. Their influence on the transition of the North cannot be overstated. When we look at the Burka warrior BJ 581 again, we have to ask ourselves, why did she fight? Was she a woman who had no male heirs to defend her family's land? Was she a professional mercenary who had found a place in the Varangian Guard? Or was she simply a person who, in the fluid social landscape of the 10th century Baltic, chose to define herself by the sword rather than the key? We may never know her personal motivations, but her existence challenges everything we thought we knew about the gendered boundaries of the past. It tells us that the Viking world was a place of high stakes and high rewards, where a woman could be a queen, a priestess, a merchant, or a warrior. The reality of the Norse woman is a story of resilience and agency. She was the one who kept the fire burning through the winter of the soul. She was the legal equal of her husband in the eyes of the law, the economic driver of the maritime expansion, and the spiritual anchor of the kin group. She was the woman who could stand at her door and declare her marriage over, or stand on the prow of a ship and lead her people to a new world. To see the Vikings truly, we must see the women clearly, not as accessories to the raid, but as the very foundation of the society that made the raids possible. They were the ones who held the keys to the house, the keys to the wealth, and the keys to the survival of the North. Theirs was a power of iron and wool, of law and luck, and it is a power that still resonates in the cold, clear light of the archaeological record. When we listen to the silence of the Burka grave or the clatter of the Oseberg ship, we are hearing the voices of women who were never silent in their own time. They were the architects of an era, and it is time we gave them their place in the shield wall of history. This status was not granted out of any modern sense of egalitarianism. It was born of necessity. In a society where the death rate for men was astronomical due to war, the hazards of the sea, and the blood feuds that were a constant feature of Norse life, women had to be capable of stepping into every role. A farm could not stop functioning because the master was dead, or in Byzantium. A widow had to be able to manage the estate, or the land would be lost. This created a class of powerful, land-owning women who were the backbone of social stability. They were the ones who negotiated peace treaties between rival families and who arranged the marriages that built empires. The Viking Age was, in many ways, a civilization managed by women in the absence of men. We see this even in the mythology. The gods of the north are not all-powerful. They are flawed, and they are frequently outwitted by the goddesses. Freya is not just a goddess of beauty. She is a goddess of war who takes half the slain. Frigg knows the fate of all men but tells no one. Skadi is a giantess who demands a husband as compensation for her father's death and hunts in the mountains with a bow. These were the archetypes that Norse women grew up with, figures of immense power, independence, and occasionally terrifying wrath. The mythology reflected the social reality. Being a woman meant having a seat at the table, a voice at the thing, and a hand on the steering oar of fate. As we move forward into the mechanics of their ships and the reach of their trade, we must keep this image of the Norse woman in our minds. She is the one who wove the sails that caught the wind. She is the one who managed the silver that bought the ships. She is the one whose laws and whose luck governed the world of the North. The Viking Age was not just a man's world. It was a world of husbands and wives, of mothers and daughters, all bound together by a code of honor and a drive for survival that knew no gender. The keys at the belt were as vital as the sword at the hip, and the woman who held them was the true sovereign of the Scandinavian soul. To forget her is to forget half of the story, and the most important half at that, the half that ensured there was a home to return to when the raiding was done. If there is one object that defines the Viking Age, one piece of technology that acted as the skeleton key to the medieval world, it is the longship. In our modern consciousness, we see these vessels as the terrifying harbingers of doom, their dragon-headed prows emerging from the fog to bring fire and sword to the monasteries of Europe. We imagine massive, heavy wooden walls crashing through the waves, towering over the puny fishing boats of the Anglo-Saxons. But this image, while evocative, misses the sheer, breathtaking genius of Norse naval engineering. The Viking ship was not a floating fortress. It was a masterpiece of supple, organic architecture. It was the most sophisticated vehicle on the planet for nearly 3 centuries. A fusion of hydrodynamic art and brutal pragmatism that allowed a small population of Scandinavian farmers to dominate a territory stretching from the edge of the North American coast to the heart of the Russian river systems. To understand the Viking is to understand the ship. For the Norseman did not merely sail his vessel. He wore it like a second skin. The primary myth we must deconstruct is the idea that these ships were rigid and heavy. Most cinematic reconstructions show hulls that are too deep and wood that is too thick, making the ships look like modern rowing boats on a larger scale. The archaeological reality, found in the mud of the Roskilde Fjord and the clay of the Oseberg burial, reveals something far more alien and impressive. The Vikings utilized a construction method known as clinker building. Instead of placing planks edge to edge against a heavy internal frame, as the Mediterranean shipbuilders did, the Norsemen overlapped their planks, usually split from the finest oak, and riveted them together with iron. This seems like a small distinction, but its physical implications were revolutionary. Because the planks were thin, often less than an inch thick, and held together by rivets, the entire hull was flexible. A Viking ship did not resist the ocean. It danced with it. When a longship hit a heavy Atlantic swell, the hull would twist and groan, the wood yielding to the pressure of the water rather than snapping against it. It was a living thing, supple as a willow branch. Modern sailors who have built and tested authentic have reported a sensation of the floorboards under their feet shifting by several inches during a storm. To a modern mind, this sounds like a catastrophe. To a Norseman, it was the secret of their survival. This flexibility allowed them to build ships that were incredibly light, yet strong enough to cross the open ocean. The technical brilliance began long before the ship hit the water, in the very selection of the timber. A Viking master shipbuilder did not use a saw. To saw wood is to cut across the grain, creating a plank that is structurally weak and prone to snapping. Instead, they used wedges to split the oak logs along the grain, following the natural fibers of the wood. This meant that every plank possessed the full, uncompromised strength of the tree. This allowed the ships to be remarkably thin and light, reducing their displacement. This brings us to the most terrifying tactical advantage of the Viking Age: the draft. A standard warship, or langskip, even when fully loaded with 60 warriors and their gear, drew only about 36 inches of water. They could sail up rivers that were thought to be impassable. They could be beached on any sandy shore, without the need for a harbor or a stone quay. This was the stealth bomber of the 9th century. You could be 100 miles inland, deep in the heart of France or England, feeling perfectly safe behind your river defenses, only to look out at dawn and see a fleet of dragon ships sitting in the shallows of a stream that you thought wouldn't even float a raft. However, the warship was only half of the story. We must distinguish between the langskip and the knar. If the langskip was the fighter jet, the knar was the heavy transport. It was deeper, wider, and relied almost entirely on its sail rather than oars. This was the vessel that settled the North Atlantic. It was the knar that carried the cattle, the sheep, the families, and the thousands of pounds of wool and walrus ivory that fueled the Norse economy. While the warship was a creature of speed and shallow water, the knar was a master of the deep. It was in these heavy merchant ships that the Vikings performed the most improbable feat of the medieval era: the crossing of the open North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America. This leads us to the second great myth of Viking seafaring: the idea that they were merely coastal huggers who were terrified of losing sight of land. For generations, historians believed that the Norsemen only navigated by landmarks, following the coast from point to point. But the settlement of Iceland, which lies hundreds of miles across some of the most treacherous water on Earth, proves otherwise. To survive the open sea, the Vikings developed a system of empirical navigation that bordered on the miraculous. They didn't have a compass, and they didn't have a sextant. yet they could maintain a straight line across thousands of miles of featureless ocean. They did this through an intimate, ancestral knowledge of the natural world. They observed the flight patterns of birds, knowing that certain species only flew a specific distance from land. They tracked the migration of whales, following the whale road to find the currents that led to new islands. They read the color of the water and the shape of the clouds, sensing the presence of land long before it appeared on the horizon. But there was a more mysterious tool in their arsenal, one that was long dismissed as a legend until modern science proved it possible: the sunstone, or solarstein. The sagas mention a magical stone that allowed the heroes to find the position of the sun even in thick fog or after sunset. For a long time, this was viewed as a poetic invention. But in recent decades, researchers have identified the Icelandic spar, a transparent form of calcite, as the likely candidate. This crystal has the unique property of double refraction and can polarize light. When you look through a piece of Icelandic spar at the sky, the light splits into two beams. By rotating the stone until the two beams are equal in intensity, a navigator can pinpoint the sun's location with an accuracy of within 1 degree, even when the sun is completely hidden behind clouds or has dipped below the horizon. This was a piece of high-tech optical equipment in the hands of a 10th century sailor. Combined with the Unartok disk, a sophisticated wooden solar compass that could determine true north based on the shadow of a gnomon, the Vikings possessed a navigational suite that allowed them to treat the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a highway. The heart of the ship's power, however, was the sail. As we've discussed, the production of these sails was a monumental task undertaken by the women of the North. But the physics of the Viking sail were just as impressive as the labor. These were not the simple square sheets of the ancient world. They were made of heavy, felted wool, often treated with a mixture of animal fat, resin, and fish oil to make them airtight and water-repellent. This made the sail heavy, but it also gave it a structural integrity that allowed it to hold a complex aerodynamic shape. By using a beitas, a stiffening pole that could be used to tension the leading edge of the sail, the Vikings could do something that most ancient ships could not. They could sail against the wind. They could tack at an angle that allowed them to move forward even when the breeze was coming from their destination. This maneuverability changed the rules of geography. Distance was no longer measured in miles, but in doigar, a day's sailing. Under the right conditions, a longship could cover over 150 miles in 24 hours. This meant that the entire coastline of Europe, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, was within a few weeks' reach of a Norwegian fjord. The physical experience of being on one of these ships was a test of human endurance. There were no decks to hide under. Whether you were a king or a thrall, you slept on the floorboards in a leather sleeping bag, exposed to the freezing spray and the driving rain. The ships were crowded. The smell of wood tar and damp wool was suffocating, and the sound of the hull flexing and the water rushing past the planks was constant. There were no toilets. Men relieved themselves over the side, clinging to the rigging. Food was cold, dried fish, hard bread, and sour ale. Yet, the bond between a crew and their ship was almost religious. The ships were given names like Long Serpent, Wave Walker, or Sea Steed. They were often adorned with carved dragon heads at the prow, which were not just decorations, but spiritual safeguards. According to Norse law, these dragon heads had to be removed when approaching a friendly shore, so as not to frighten the local land spirits, or landvetter. The ship was a diplomatic entity, as much as a vessel of war. The engineering of the keel was perhaps the most critical innovation. The Viking keel was T-shaped, a deep, heavy beam of oak that acted as the ship's spine. This provided incredible lateral stability, preventing the ship from being blown sideways by the wind, while still allowing for a very shallow draft. This T-keel was the result of centuries of trial and error, moving from the paddled vessels of the pre-Viking era to the fully sailed ships of the 8th century. It was the foundation that allowed the Norse to build larger and larger ships, culminating in the great ships of the late 10th century, which could carry over 100 men. When we look at the Oseberg and Gokstad ships today, preserved in the hushed silence of a museum, we are looking at the peak of a lost technology. These were not the crude boats of a primitive people. They were the result of a profound understanding of materials, fluid dynamics, and the geometry of the natural world. They were built without blueprints, using knowledge passed from master to apprentice through the rhythm of the hammer and the feel of the wood. The Viking ship was the primary reason for the Viking Age. Without this specific technological breakthrough, the Norse would have remained a footnote in Scandinavian history, a collection of isolated tribes on the edge of the world. But with the ship, they became the masters of the world's oceans. They were the first to bridge the gap between the Old World and the New, the first to connect the Arctic to the Orient. The legacy of this engineering is still with us. Every time we use the word starboard, we are using a Viking term. The steerboard was the large oar fixed to the right-hand side of the ship's stern, which the pilot used to guide the vessel. Because the steering oar was on the right, sailors would dock their ships with the left side against the quay to avoid damaging the oar. This left side became the port side. Our very language of the sea is a Viking language. The clinker method continued to influence boat building for 1,000 years. The design of the North Sea fishing trawler and the Atlantic yacht can trace their DNA directly back to the oak planks, split by a Norse shipwright in a foggy fjord. The ships were also the ultimate status symbol. A king was judged by the size and beauty of his fleet. The Sun King Harald Fairhair, or the legendary Olaf Tryggvason, didn't just want a ship that could fight. They wanted a ship that would dazzle the eye. They used gold and silver to decorate the prows, and the sails were often striped with vibrant colors or embroidered with the symbols of their house. To see a fleet of 30 or 40 of these ships approaching was to see a display of wealth and power that was unparalleled in the medieval world. It was a psychological weapon. Before the first warrior stepped onto the sand, the ship had already won half the battle. But we must return to the most profound truth of the Norse vessel: its connection to the soul. For a Viking, the ship was the vessel of life and the vessel of death. They were born into a world defined by the sea, and when they died, the wealthiest and most powerful among them were buried in their ships, as if the vessel that had carried them through the world could also carry them into the next. The Oseberg Queen didn't just take her jewelry and her servants with her. She took her ship. She was laid to rest in a 90-foot oak vessel, ready to sail the currents of the afterlife. This reveals a culture that saw no separation between their technology and their spirit. The ship was their home, their weapon, their warehouse, and their tomb. As we look at the mechanics of the drakkar and the knarr, we see a people who were the supreme pragmatists of history. They didn't wait for the world to come to them. They built the tools to go out and take the world. They mastered the wind and the wave with a suppleness of mind and material that remains staggering to this day. The Viking ship was not just a boat. It was the physical manifestation of a culture that refused to be contained by its geography. It was a bridge of oak and wool that spanned the globe, and its wake still ripples through our history. The shadow of the dragonhead prow still falls across our maps, a reminder that with the right engineering and a reckless enough spirit, the entire world is within reach of a shallow draft hull and a well-tensioned sail. The Viking Age was the age of the ship, and the ship was the greatest work of art the North ever produced. When we consider the transition from the Viking Age to the Middle Ages, we see the ship evolve, but the core principles remain. The ships grew larger, the castles on the prows grew higher, but the spirit of the clinker-built hull lived on. It was this technology that allowed for the exploration of the Baltic, the establishment of the Hanseatic League, and the eventual European expansion across the globe. But it all started here, in the small, smoke-filled shipyards of 8th century Scandinavia, where a man with a wedge and an axe looked at an oak tree and saw not just wood, but a way to reach the horizon. The naval superiority of the Vikings was not just a matter of luck or brutality. It was a matter of extreme, focused intelligence. They were the world's first true oceanographers, and the ships they built were the keys that unlocked the modern world. Every time a ship crosses the Atlantic today, it follows a path first carved by the T-shaped keel and the polarized light of a sunstone. We are all living in the world the longships built. The reach of these vessels was truly global. A ship built in a Norwegian forest could sail down the Russian rivers, be portaged, dragged across land on rollers, between the Dnieper and the Volga, and eventually emerge into the Black Sea to threaten the walls of Constantinople. This ability to move between saltwater and freshwater, between the open ocean and the narrowest river, was a tactical flexibility that no other navy possessed. It made the Vikings the masters of the interior lines of Europe. They could strike anywhere, at any time. This was the true source of their naval superiority. It wasn't just about winning battles at sea, though they did that too, with massive naval engagements involving hundreds of ships. It was about the fact that the sea was their home, and for everyone else, the sea was a barrier. To the Viking, the water was a path. To the rest of the world, it was a wall. And that difference in perspective, fueled by the most advanced maritime technology of the age, changed the course of human history forever. The longship was the dragon that swallowed the world, and we are still fascinated by its scales. We have spent centuries focusing on the sound of the Viking axe hitting a monastery door, but we have largely ignored the sound that truly defined the Viking Age: the clinking of silver coins in a merchant's scale. To understand the Norsemen, we must move past the image of the blood-stained raider and embrace the reality of the merchant king. The Vikings were the premier globalists of the early Middle Ages. They were the connective tissue of a fractured world, a people who saw no contradiction between being a warrior on Monday and a textile wholesaler on Tuesday. while the rest of Europe was largely insular, retreating into the localized safety of the feudal system. The Norsemen were looking outward. They were the bridge between the frozen forests of the Arctic and the sun-drenched markets of Baghdad. They were the men and women who turned the North Sea and the Baltic into a vast, liquid highway. And their true legacy is not a trail of ashes, but a web of trade routes that spanned thousands of miles. To find the heart of this global empire, we do not look to the battlefield. We look to the silver hoards buried in the soil of Gotland and the silk fragments found in the graves of Birka. The fuel that drove the Viking expansion was not a thirst for blood, but an insatiable hunger for silver. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Scandinavia did not have a mint of its own. It didn't need one. It operated on what historians call a bullion economy. In this world, the value of a coin was not determined by the image of the king stamped upon it, but by the weight and purity of the metal itself. This produced the phenomenon of hack silver. If you wanted to buy a cow but only had a heavy silver arm ring, you simply took your knife and hacked off a piece of the ring until it balanced the scales. This was a world of absolute pragmatism. Every merchant carried a set of folding bronze scales and a collection of lead weights, often decorated with beautiful enamels or stolen bits of Irish metalwork. They were ready to do business anywhere, with anyone, in any currency. This obsession with silver drew them inexorably toward the east. While the west had monasteries filled with gold and land, the east had something much more liquid: the Islamic dirham. In the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilization on earth. From their capital in Baghdad, they controlled a vast network of trade that stretched to China and India. They had a surplus of silver, and they had a desperate need for the raw materials of the north. The Vikings, particularly the Swedish Norsemen known as the Russ, stepped into this vacuum. They realized that the river systems of modern-day Russia and Ukraine, the Volga and the Dnieper, were the back doors to the Silk Road. They would load their shallow draft ships with the gold of the north, furs from the marten, the fox, and the beaver, amber gathered from the Baltic shores, and, most profitably and tragically, human beings. The thrall, or slave trade, was the dark engine of the Viking economy. They captured thousands of Slavs, Anglo-Saxons, and Celts, and moved them down the river systems to be sold in the markets of the Caliphate. This was a trade of such scale that it fundamentally shifted the demographics and the economies of two continents. The journey to the east, the Osterweger, was an epic feat of endurance. The Rus had to navigate the treacherous rapids of the Dnieper, where they would often have to unlade their ships and drag them on rollers for miles across the dry land, all while under constant threat from Pecheneг nomads. But the reward at the end was Miklagard, the great city, Constantinople. When the Norsemen first saw the towering walls and golden domes of the Byzantine capital, it must have seemed like a city of the gods. They didn't just come to raid it, they came to join it. The Byzantine emperors, impressed by the stature and the terrifying ferocity of these Northmen, hired them as their personal bodyguards. This was the birth of the Varangian Guard. These were Norsemen who swore a sacred oath to the emperor, becoming the most elite and trusted soldiers in the eastern Mediterranean. We can still see the evidence of their presence today. In the Hagia Sophia, high in the marble galleries, there is a piece of 9th century graffiti. It is a set of runes scratched into the stone during a long church service, which simply reads, "Halfdan was here." Halfdan was a man who had traveled 3,000 miles from a cold farm in Scandinavia to the center of the world, and he wanted to leave his mark. This eastern connection brought a flood of Islamic silver into the north. In Sweden alone, over 80,000 Islamic dirhams have been found, with the island of Gotland serving as a massive subterranean vault of Eastern wealth. But the trade wasn't just in coins. In the trading hub of Helgö, archaeologists found something that seems completely out of place in a Viking Age settlement. A small bronze statue of the Buddha, cast in northern India in the 6th century. How did a Buddha reach a Swedish island in the year 800? It traveled through the hands of Khazar merchants, through the markets of the Volga, and across the Baltic Sea. The Vikings were the end point of a trade network that encompassed the known world. They were wearing Chinese silk, using Frankish swords, and praying with Indian bronzes. They were the most cosmopolitan people of their time. The epicenter of this globalism was the Wick town, of which Hedeby was the most famous. Situated on the neck of the Jutland Peninsula, Hedeby was a miracle of logistics. It was a place where a merchant could bring a ship from the Baltic, drag it just a few miles across land, and put it back in the water on the North Sea side, bypassing the dangerous sail around the tip of Denmark. Hedeby was a crowded, muddy, multi-ethnic city protected by a massive semicircular wall. In its streets, you would hear the Old Norse of the Swede, the Old English of the merchant from York, the Slavic dialects of the East, and the Arabic of the traveler from the South. It was a place of industry. There were workshops for glass blowing, amber carving, and the mass production of the oval brooches worn by Norse women. Hedeby was the proof that the Vikings were not just destroyers, but builders of systems. They created a standardized international trade network that stabilized the economy of Northern Europe. We must also reconsider the role of the jarls and kings in this trade. A Viking leader was not just a warlord, he was a CEO. His power depended on his ability to attract followers, and he attracted followers by giving them silver. To get that silver, he had to be a successful raider, but more importantly, he had to be a successful trader. He had to negotiate treaties, establish peace zones for markets, and ensure the safety of the merchants who traveled through his lands. The Thing, the communal assembly, was as much a place for settling trade disputes as it was for making laws. The Norse legal system was obsessed with property rights and contract law. If you cheated a man in a trade in a Viking market, you could be declared Nidingur, a social outcast, a man without honor. In a world of global trade, your reputation, your word fame, was your most valuable currency. This globalism even extended to their religion. As the Norsemen traveled, they absorbed the ideas of the people they met. In the grave of a woman in Burka, archaeologists found a silver ring with a violet stone. When analyzed under a microscope, the stone was found to be inscribed with Kufic Arabic script that read, "For Allah," or "To Allah." This doesn't mean the woman was a Muslim, but it does mean she valued the exotic, the sophisticated, and the powerful symbols of the distant South. The Vikings were syncretists. They were happy to wear a Thor's hammer and a Christian cross at the same time, just to be safe. They saw the world as a place of many powers, and they wanted a piece of all of them. This mental flexibility was their greatest strength. It allowed them to settle in Normandy and become French, to settle in England and become English, and to settle in Russia and become the foundation of the Kievan Rus. The Durham economy eventually collapsed in the late 10th century when the silver mines of the East began to run dry. But by then, the Vikings had already changed the world. They had kick-started the urban revolution in Ireland by founding cities like Dublin, Cork, and Limerick. They had revitalized the English economy through the Danelaw markets of York and Lincoln. They had turned the rivers of Russia into the primary trade route between Europe and Asia. When the Viking Age ended, it wasn't because they were defeated, but because they had been too successful. They had integrated themselves so deeply into the global economy that they were no longer Vikings. They were the nobility and the merchant class of a dozen different nations. To see the merchant king, we must look at the scales and the weights. We must see the merchant who slept on the deck of his nar, guarding a cargo of walrus ivory that would eventually be carved into the crucifixes of German bishops. We must see the Varangian Guard member who returned home to Norway with a chest full of Byzantine gold and a mind full of Greek philosophy. We must see the woman in burqa, her silk dress rustling as she walks through a market filled with the smell of cinnamon and cloves. This was the reality of the Norsemen. They were the masters of the long-distance trade, the explorers of the economic frontier. They understood that wealth was not something to be hoarded in a cold room, but something to be moved, traded, and displayed. The complexity of their financial systems is often overlooked. They understood the concept of debt, of credit, and of interest. They had a sophisticated understanding of supply and demand. When the supply of walrus ivory from Greenland increased, they knew how to manage the market in Europe to keep prices stable. They were the first people to link the Arctic ecology to the Mediterranean economy. A walrus killed in the freezing waters of the Davis Strait would pay for a glass of wine poured in a villa in Sicily. This is a level of connectivity that we usually associate with the modern era, but the Vikings were doing it 1,000 years ago. Their ships were the trucks of the medieval world. The Cunard, with its deep hull and high sides, could carry up to 20 tons of cargo across the most violent seas on Earth. This allowed for the movement of bulk goods, not just luxury items. They moved grain, timber, and salt. They made it possible for communities in the far north to survive by trading their specialized goods for the basic necessities of life. This interdependence was the foundation of the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. It wasn't just about raiding your neighbor. It was about needing your neighbor as a customer. As we look at the maps of their trade routes, we see a world that was much smaller than we thought. The Silk Road didn't end in Byzantium. It ended in the fjords of Norway. The Fur Road didn't end in the Baltic. It ended in the palaces of Baghdad. The Vikings were the drivers of this world. They were the ones who were willing to take the risks, to sail into the unknown, and to talk to anyone if there was a profit to be made. They were the great pragmatists of history, the men and women who realized that the sword could open a door, but the scale could build a kingdom. When we hear the word Viking, we should not just think of the fire and the scream. We should think of the quiet negotiation in a tent on the banks of the Volga. We should think of the scribe in Constantinople recording the names of the Norsemen who had come to serve the emperor. We should think of the silver Durham, worn thin by the fingers of 100 different merchants, as it traveled from the heart of Asia to a buried pot in a Swedish field. The merchant kings were the true architects of the Viking Age. They built a world that was connected, vibrant, and incredibly wealthy. They were the ones who ensured that the Norse identity would not be a brief, violent spark, but a lasting, global legacy. They were the globalists of the North, and the world we live in today, with its interconnected markets and its fluid borders, is the descendant of the world they built with their scales, their silver, and their relentless seafaring spirit. In the end, the Viking was a man who lived by the wind and the silver. He knew that the sea was a highway, and that every person he met was either a customer, a partner, or a source of information. This openness to the world, this refusal to be confined by geography or tradition, is what made them the merchant kings. They didn't just raid the world, they embraced it. They took the best of everything they found, from the laws of the Franks to the silver of the Arabs, to the art of the Irish, and they wove it into a culture that was as rich and complex as the silk they so prized. To see them only as raiders is to miss the most important part of their story. They were the businessmen of the Middle Ages, the pioneers of the global economy, and the men and women who proved that the furthest reaches of the earth are only as far away as your next voyage. As we look at the items they left behind, the scales, the coins, the silk, the Buddha, we see a people who were at home in the world. They were not barbarians looking in at civilization. They were the ones who were defining what civilization could be. They were building a world where a person could travel from the edge of the Atlantic to the heart of Asia and find a common language in the weight of silver and the quality of a piece of fur. That is the true Viking achievement. It is a story of human connection, of economic ambition, and of the incredible world-spanning power of the merchant kings. Their silver hoards are still being found today, a constant reminder that once, for a few centuries, the North was the center of a global web that reached every corner of the known world. And the man who buried that silver was not just a warrior. He was a participant in a grand global adventure that changed the face of the earth forever. To understand the spirit of the Viking, you must first forget everything you think you know about Valhalla. In our modern popular culture, we have turned the Norse afterlife into a heavy metal paradise, a never-ending frat party of mead-chugging and axe-swinging, where every bearded warrior goes the moment he falls. We see it as a reward for mindless violence, a celestial barracks for the brave. But if you were to speak to a 9th century Norseman about his soul, you would find a world view that was far more sophisticated, far more exclusive, and infinitely more terrifying. The Norse did not have a religion in the way we understand it today. They did not have a church, a central scripture, or a set of moral dogmas. Instead, they had a series of negotiations, with a landscape that was alive with powerful, often indifferent, and occasionally malevolent forces. Their faith was a faith of the sword, not because they loved war, but because they lived in a cosmos that was fundamentally broken, a world where even the gods were destined to die. To find the reality of Norse belief, we must look past the romanticized sagas written by later Christian scholars and stare directly into the smoke of the funeral pyre and the blood of the sacrifice. The first myth to dismantle is the idea that Valhalla was the universal goal. In reality, Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was a highly exclusive club for the aristocratic warrior elite. It was the personal hall of Odin, the Allfather, a god of wisdom, poetry, and betrayal. Odin wasn't looking for good people. He was looking for the most effective killers to serve as his Einherjar, his standing army for the final battle of Ragnarok. If you were a farmer, a merchant, or a woman who died of old age or illness, Valhalla was not for you. In fact, according to the mythology, even among those who died in battle, Odin only got half. The other half went to Folkvangr, the field of the people, ruled by the goddess Freya. While the sagas are frustratingly vague about what life in Folkvangr was like, it represents a profound feminine power at the heart of the Norse afterlife. For the vast majority of the population, the carls, the thralls, and the children, the destination was simply hell. In the Viking Age, hell was not a place of fire and brimstone. It was a continuation of life in a gray, misty world beneath the roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil. It was a place of ancestral quiet, not of punishment. The Norse were not obsessed with sin or salvation. They were obsessed with luck and reputation. This focus on reputation is what drove the terrifying ritual of the Viking funeral. To understand the visceral reality of Norse paganism, we have no better witness than Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat who encountered a group of Swedish Vikings, the Rus, on the banks of the Volga River in the year 922. His account is one of the most harrowing and important documents in human history. He describes the funeral of a high-ranking chieftain, and it is a far cry from the sanitized boat floating into the sunset of the movies. It was a 10-day ordeal of ritualized trauma. The chieftain was placed in a temporary grave while his people prepared his ship. A young slave girl volunteered to accompany him into the afterlife, though the word volunteer is used loosely in a culture of absolute social hierarchy. Ibn Fadlan describes her being led from tent to tent, engaging in ritualized sexual acts with the men of the village, before being brought to the ship. There, an elderly woman, known as the Angel of Death, performed a brutal, ritualistic execution. The girl was both strangled and stabbed while the warriors beat their shields with wooden staves to drown out her screams, so that other slave girls would not be frightened of the journey. Finally, the ship, the chieftain, the girl, and a collection of sacrificed animals, horses, dogs, and oxen, were set ablaze. As the fire roared, a Norseman told Ibn Fadlan that the Arabs were fools because they put their loved ones in the earth to be eaten by worms, while the Norse burned them so they could enter the afterlife in a single instant. This was a faith of transformation through fire and blood. The archaeology of sacrifice confirms that Ibn Fadlan was not merely exaggerating for a foreign audience. At the site of Trelleborg in Denmark, archaeologists discovered wells containing the remains of sacrificed animals and, chillingly, young children. At Uppsala in Sweden, Adam of Bremen described a sacred grove where the bodies of men and animals hung from the trees as offerings to the gods. For the Norse, the gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, Tyr, were not moral guardians. They were powerful, capricious neighbors who needed to be fed. This was the blot, the sacrificial feast. You didn't pray for forgiveness. You traded with the gods. You gave a life, a horse, a pig, a human, to ensure our Frieder, a good harvest, and peace. It was a cold, contractual spirituality, born of a world where nature could kill you at any moment. Central to this worldview were the Norns, the three weavers of fate who sat at the base of the world tree. The Norse believed in absolute predestination. The wired, or fate, of a man was woven at the moment of his birth, and not even the gods could change it. This is the psychological secret of the Viking Age. If your death is already scheduled, then fear is a waste of time. The only thing you can control is your reaction to the inevitable. This produced a culture of reckless courage. If you are destined to die on a Tuesday, you can charge into 1,000 swords on Monday, and you will not receive a scratch. But when Tuesday comes, no shield will save you. This philosophy allowed the Vikings to sail into the unknown and fight against impossible odds. It wasn't that they didn't value life, it was that they valued word fame, the stories told about them after they were gone, above all else. As the Havamal says, "Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will also die. But I know one thing that never dies, the reputation of each dead man." But as the Viking Age progressed, this grim, fatalistic world began to collide with a new power from the south, the White Christ. The transition from paganism to Christianity is often portrayed as a sudden, violent conquest. But the truth is a centuries-long process of syncretism, a messy blending of two worlds. The Vikings were pragmatists. When they traveled to England or Francia, they saw that the Christian kings had better trade networks and more stable institutions. They began to see ne'er to take the sign of the cross, not because they necessarily believed in the divinity of Jesus, but because it was a requirement for doing business. In the archaeological record, we find the dual-use molds. These were soapstone molds used by smiths that could cast a Thor's hammer and a Christian cross at the same time. A merchant would carry both, wearing whichever one was most advantageous for the port he was in. The Christ that the Vikings eventually accepted was not the suffering servant of the modern era. He was the Christus Victor. To a Norseman, the idea of a god who allowed himself to be crucified was at first confusing, even shameful. So, the early missionaries pivoted. They presented Jesus as a powerful new chieftain, a king who had descended into the underworld to do battle with death and emerged victorious. He was a god of luck who was stronger than Odin and Thor because he had conquered the one thing they couldn't, the grave. We see this on the Jelling stones in Denmark, where King Harald Bluetooth famously claimed to have won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The depiction of Christ on the Jelling stone looks like a Viking warrior, entwined in the ribbons of Norse art, standing strong and unyielding. It was a conversion of power, not of theology. The adoption of Christianity was often a political decision made at the Thing, the communal assembly. In Iceland in the year 1000, the law speaker Thorgeir Thorkelson was tasked with deciding whether the island should remain pagan or become Christian. After a day and a night of silent meditation, he realized that a house divided by two laws could not stand. He declared that all Icelanders would be baptized, but with a crucial Viking compromise. People could still sacrifice to the old gods in private, as long as it wasn't seen. It was a legal solution to a spiritual problem. Christianity brought with it something the Vikings desperately needed as they built their kingdoms: literacy, centralized bureaucracy, and the concept of divine right of kings. An Odin-worshipping king was just the first among equals. A Christian king was the chosen of God. For a ruler like Harald Hardrada, or Knut the Great, the White Christ was the ultimate tool for nation-building. The transition was slow and left deep scars in the Scandinavian soul. For centuries, the old land spirits, the Landvetter, lived on in folklore. The gods became demons, then myths, then fairy tales. But the faith of the sword never entirely vanished. It lived on in the Norse legal codes, in the sagas, and in the sheer stubborn independence of the North. Even as they built stone cathedrals, they carved dragons on the rooflines. Even as they prayed to the Virgin Mary, they told stories of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. The Viking Age did not end with the death of the old gods. It ended with their absorption. To understand the end of this era, we must look at the Ragnarok of the mind. The Norse believed that the world would eventually end in a great winter, a Fimbul winter, followed by a final battle where the giants would devour the sun and the gods would fall. This gave their lives a sense of tragic grandeur. They were the only people in history who believed their gods were on the losing side. This created a culture of ultimate defiance. If the world is going to burn anyway, you might as well go out with a joke on your lips and your sword in your hand. This is the true legacy of Norse faith, not a promise of paradise, but a commitment to dignity in the face of inevitable destruction. When the White Christ finally won the North, he didn't replace this spirit. He gave it a new name. The Crusades of the North, where Scandinavian kings sailed to the Holy Land or fought pagans in the Baltic, were the final expression of this warrior spirituality. They were still fighting for glory and luck. They were just doing it for a different chieftain. The reality of Viking belief is found in the tension between the angel of death on the Volga and the White Christ on the Jellingstone. It is the story of a people moving from a world of sacrifice and fate to a world of law and salvation. But through it all, the Norseman remained a creature of the sword. Whether he was dying for Odin or for Jesus, he did so with his eyes on his reputation, his heart on his luck, and his hand on the hilt of his blade. The myths of Valhalla are just the shadow of a much deeper, much more complex reality. The reality of a people who looked at a cold, dying universe and decided to laugh, to trade, and to fight until the very end. This was the faith of the sword, and it built the foundation of the modern world, weaving the old pagan courage into the new Christian order, creating a Europe that was as much a product of the longship as it was of the cathedral. As we move toward the final chapter of the Viking Age, let us remember the Völva, the seeress buried with her iron staff. She represents the old world, the world of magic, of spirits, and of a future that was already written. She saw the end coming long before the first Christian monk arrived. She knew that the old gods would pass, that the mead halls of the sky would fall silent, and that a new light would rise from the south. But she also knew that the spirit of the north, the spirit of the shield wall, the ship, and the sword, was something that no new god could ever truly erase. It was etched into the DNA of the people, a legacy of fire and salt that would outlast even the gods themselves. The Viking did not fear the end of his faith, he only feared being forgotten. And as long as we tell his story, he remains as immortal as any god in Valhalla. The end of the Viking Age was not a single moment of collapse, but a slow evaporation into the bedrock of a new world. To understand how an era that defined the boundaries of the known world finally came to a close, we must look at the furthest reach of the Norse wake, a place that for centuries was dismissed as a legend, a shadow on the edge of the Atlantic. In the 1960s, on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad uncovered a series of sod-walled structures at a place called Lance aux Meadows. Here, in the damp soil of the New World, they found a small bronze cloakpin of a distinctly Norse style, and the remains of a smithy where iron had been smelted from bog ore. This was Vinland. 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain, the Vikings had already bridged the Atlantic. But Vinland was not the beginning of an empire. It was the final, overextended breath of a dying era. In the sagas of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red, we find the story of a people who had reached the absolute limit of their technology and their luck. They encountered a people they called Skraelings, the indigenous inhabitants of North America. And for the first time in their history, the Vikings found themselves outnumbered and outmatched in a landscape too vast to conquer. The Vinland colony failed not because the Norse were weak, but because the distance from the source was too great. Greenland, their vital stepping stone, was itself a precarious outpost, struggling against a cooling climate and the shifting patterns of the ivory trade. As the sea ice thickened and the walrus markets of Europe shifted toward elephant ivory from the south, the westernmost branch of the Viking world began to wither. While the outposts in the west were fading, the heart of the Viking world was undergoing a radical transformation. The era of the independent jarl and the freebooting raider was being replaced by the era of the king and the state. By the early 11th century, the North Sea Empire of Knut the Great represented the pinnacle of this new reality. Knut was a Christian king who ruled over England, Denmark, and Norway, a sovereign who moved with ease between the courts of Europe and the mead halls of the North. He was no longer a Viking in the 9th century sense. He was a medieval statesman. The old ways of the Viking, the summer raid for silver and thralls, were becoming an obstacle to the stability of these new, centralized kingdoms. The sea kings were becoming land kings. This brings us to the year 1066, a date traditionally cited as the end of the Viking Age, marked by the fall of the man often called the last Viking, Harald Hardrada. Harald Hardrada's life was a microcosm of the entire Viking experience. He had been an exile, a mercenary in the Varangian Guard of Constantinople, a warrior who had seen the sun glint off the domes of Jerusalem and the sands of Sicily. He returned to Norway with a fortune in Byzantine gold and a vision of a restored North Sea empire. In September 1066, he landed his fleet in northern England, claiming the English throne. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The accounts of the battle are legendary. The story of a lone Norse giant holding the narrow wooden bridge against the entire English army, felling 40 men with his axe before being struck down from below. But the reality was a tactical nightmare. The Norse were caught without their mail coats, resting in the unseasonable heat, and the shield wall, the formation that had dominated Europe for 300 years, finally broke under the relentless pressure of Harold Godwinson's forces. When an arrow pierced Harold Hardrada's throat, the dream of a Norse England died with him. But the irony of 1066 is that the man who would ultimately conquer England just weeks later at Hastings was William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, and the direct descendant of Rollo, the Viking raider who had been granted land by the French king over a century earlier. The Vikings had not been defeated. They had transformed into the Normans. They had traded their longships for heavy cavalry and their longhouses for stone castles. They were the same blood, the same restless spirit, but they had adopted a new language, a new faith, and a new way of war. This transformation is the true legacy of the Norsemen. They didn't disappear. They became us. When we look at the genetic map of modern Europe, The ghost of the longship is everywhere. In the British Isles, particularly in the Danelaw and the Northern Isles of Scotland, the DNA of the Norse is woven into the very fabric of the population. In Normandy, in Sicily, and along the great river systems of Russia and Ukraine, the genetic signature of the Scandinavian expansion remains a permanent record of their movement. But their legacy is even more present in the way we speak and the way we govern. The English language is a Viking hybrid. Common words, sky, knife, cake, egg, husband, fellow, law, take, give, are all gifts from the Old Norse. The very structure of our days, with Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday named for Tyr, Odin, Thor, and Freya, is a weekly tribute to the gods of the North. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings left us the seeds of modern democracy. The Thing, the communal assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes and make laws, was the foundation of the Icelandic Althing, the oldest surviving parliament in the world. The Norse understood that a society without law was a society of chaos. They brought the concept of the jury of 12 to England, a system that would eventually become the cornerstone of Western jurisprudence. They were a people obsessed with property rights, contracts, and the idea that even a king was subject to the law of the assembly. The power of the keys, held by the Norse woman, and the legal autonomy she possessed, were precursors to the long struggle for gender equality. As the 11th century drew to a close, the Viking worldview finally merged with the broader European identity. The great stave churches of Norway, with their intricate wood carvings of dragons and serpents entwining the cross, are the physical manifestation of this synthesis. The Viking had become a crusader, a knight, a merchant, and a clerk. The aesthetic fallacy of the horned helmet was left behind in the mud of the past, replaced by the heraldry of the medieval knight. But the spirit of the sea remained. The maritime technology of the North, the clinker-built hull and the deep keel, would continue to evolve, eventually providing the foundations for the age of discovery. The path the Vikings carved across the North Atlantic was the first stitch in the fabric of a truly global world. We have deconstructed 1,000 myths to find the people beneath the soot and the fur. We have found a society that was clean, colorful, and technologically advanced. We have seen women who managed empires and warriors who fought with the precision of mathematicians. We have explored a faith that looked into the face of a dying universe and chose to live with honor and luck. The Vikings were not the monsters under the bed of history. They were the architects of a new kind of world, a world that was mobile, interconnected, and relentlessly pragmatic. They were the first globalists, the first true ocean navigators, and the men and women who taught Europe that the horizon was not a limit, but a destination. When we look at the Oseberg ship today, we should not just see a relic of a violent past. We should see the physical embodiment of human curiosity and engineering. We should see a vessel that was built to flex, to yield, and to survive the greatest pressures of the natural world. This is the metaphor for the Viking Age itself. They were a people who knew how to bend without breaking, who knew how to adapt to every culture they encountered while still retaining the core of their identity. They left us a world that is larger, more complex, and more deeply connected than it was before they set sail. The Viking Age ended not in fire, but in a quiet transition to the modern era. The longships were eventually replaced by the cog and the galleon. The runes were replaced by the Latin alphabet, and the mead halls were replaced by the stone palaces of Europe. But if you stand on a pebbled beach, in a Norwegian fjord, or on the wind-swept cliffs of Yorkshire, you can still feel the echo of that world. It is in the sound of the waves, the cold bite of the wind, and the stubborn, independent spirit of the people who still call the North their home. We are the inheritors of their word fame. We carry their laws in our courts, their words in our mouths, and their DNA in our blood. The Vikings did not fall. They arrived, and they have been with us ever since. A reminder that the world is always open to those with the courage to build a ship and the will to follow the sun. In the final analysis, the story of the Vikings is the story of the human drive to transcend the boundaries of the known. It is the story of how a small group of people, armed only with iron, wood, and a relentless code of honor, transformed the face of a continent and reached across an ocean to touch a new world. They were the people of the ship, the people of the sword, and the people of the law. As the sun sets on our deep dive into their history, we leave behind the horned helmets and the pop culture tropes to honor the reality of a civilization that was as beautiful as it was brutal, as sophisticated as it was simple. The Viking Age is over, but the Viking spirit, the spirit of the explorer, the merchant, and the lawgiver, is immortal. It is the light that guided them through the Fimble winter, the luck that carried them across the Whale Road, and the legacy that continues to shape our world today. Their story is our story, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the enduring strength of the northern soul. The legacy of the Vikings is also found in the very concept of the city. Before the Norsemen arrived, much of northern Europe and the British Isles was a collection of rural hamlets and isolated monasteries. The Vikings were the great urbanizers. They saw the potential in a muddy bend of the River Liffey and founded Dublin. They saw the strategic value of the hills of York and the banks of the Neva. They created trade hubs that allowed for the exchange of ideas as well as goods. They were the ones who realized that the future of wealth was in the city, the market, and the port. This urban revolution changed the social structure of Europe, creating a middle class of merchants and artisans who would eventually challenge the power of the feudal lords. The Viking Age was the labor pain of the modern state. Even their failure in Vinland tells us something profound about the human spirit. The Norse were the first to face the sheer scale of the Atlantic and to realize that the world was larger than they could ever have imagined. Their retreat from North America was not a defeat, but an act of survival, a realization that even the most daring explorers have limits. But the fact that they reached it at all, in open wooden boats without a compass, remains one of the greatest achievements in the history of navigation. It serves as a reminder that the human will to explore is older than our technology and more powerful than our maps. As we close the final chapter of this documentary, let us reflect on the concept of hamingja, the ancestral luck that the Norse prized above all else. They believed that luck was not a random occurrence, but a quality that could be earned through honor, bravery, and intelligence. When we look at the legacy they left behind, it is clear that their luck has endured. It lives on in the stability of the Scandinavian nations, in the resilience of the English legal system, and in the vibrant, interconnected world they helped to create. The Viking Age was a crucible, a period of intense pressure and transformation that forged the modern identity of the West. We are the children of the North, the descendants of the raiders and the traitors, the kings and the thralls. The story of the Vikings is a reminder that history is not a static list of dates and battles, but a living, breathing process of change. It is a story of how we became who we are. By stripping away the myths of the horned helmets and the mindless savagery, we have found something much more valuable: a mirror. In the Vikings, we see our own ambition, our own flaws, and our own capacity for greatness. We see a people who were not afraid to face the darkness of the unknown, and who found a way to make it their own. The dragon-headed ships may have vanished from the horizon, but the wake they left behind is still visible if you know where to look. It is in every map that shows a connected world, in every law that protects the rights of the individual, and in every heart that feels the pull of the distant sea. The Viking Age has ended, but the voyage continues. Is there more to tell? Always. History is an infinite tapestry, and every thread we pull reveals a new pattern. We could spend 1,000 years studying the runes, the sagas, and the soil, and we would still only be scratching the surface of the Norse experience. But for now, we leave them in the misty fjords of our memory, a people of iron and silk, of fire and salt, who sailed into history and never looked back. Their luck is our luck, their fame is our fame, and their story is the heartbeat of the North, a drumbeat that will never truly fade as long as the sea meets the shore and the wind carries the scent of the unknown. This has been the true history of the Vikings, beyond the myth, into the reality, and toward a future they helped to build, with every stroke of the oar and every strike of the axe. The end of the era is only the beginning of our understanding. Would you like to explore the next chapter of human history? Or shall we let the Norsemen rest in their ship burials, dreaming of the horizon and the luck that never dies?